Blind. Welcome to today's webinar. The topic is playing bluff catchers big blind versus button. And so that means playing bluff catchers with wide ranges involved, which is the toughest. Bluff catching is a very crucial topic in general, because this is obviously the area where I think not only is it the toughest to decide, it's also we will be punished the most if we make big mistakes here, in my opinion. Sure, the top of our range, we also need to mix like raises and calls, and this is important and actually goes into bluff catching. We will see why later on. But specifically bluff catching with pairs, and for the purpose of this webinar, we're focusing mostly on bluff catchers, meaning pairs basically. So under pair, second pair, third pair, not so much ace high. We're talking about that too. But I want to specifically focus on the pairs as far as bluff catchers go. So that's what I would refer to when I say bluff catchers here. Yeah, so let me say what my goal is for this webinar. First of all, I want to be pointing out all the important factors for handling bluff catchers in the big blind versus the button. Also, this will apply in general. And then very importantly, I want to increase understanding of the ICM impact on the strategies, because there are some big strategy changes that we need to do, and how to adjust exactly. And then lastly, I want to tackle the problem of mixing, which is also more nuanced than one might think. Like in certain spots and certain board structures where there's many draws available for our bluff catchers, it's not really about mixing. Like we have certain very preferred bluff catchers. Then there's the boards that are dry, where not necessarily even dry boards, but just simply boards where our second and third pairs and so on do not have any draws available to go with them. And so there's, more mixing going on, but also still there's blocker effects, sometimes having certain bluff catchers being preferred than others. Bluff catchers I will get into a little bit, but I think that is a topic for itself really, as this is like very complicated. We will still talk about that a little bit, and we will definitely talk over that as well, but I want to mostly focus on the broader strategy here. First, the simple things, because even though they might be obvious, very important to always consider when we're facing bluff catchers or bluff catching situations. We arrive to the turn with the second pair, third pair, under pair, etc. It's obviously the bigger the bet we face, the less bluff catching we need to do. Now, GTO always, or not always, but there's lots of spots on turns like drawy turns, etc., where GTO wants to do a bunch of overbetting or pot betting, etc. My personal observation is that the field in tournaments isn't doing that as much as GTO does it. So what that means is we're generally facing more conventional bet sizings, which then means we need to mix in more bluff catchers than, if we were facing an appropriate, let's say, overbet or whatever, and then we pick only the bluff catchers that have draws to go with them. But if we face like smaller bet sizings on boards, which usually we wouldn't be facing that against the GTO player, then, we need to mix in additional hands. So that kind of makes it harder. Because, again, we need to mix in more marginal hands on turns, and then we also face some more marginal river decisions. Yeah, there's that, definitely. And then also, versus wide ranges, so versus late position, more bluff catching is necessary on turns and rivers than versus tight ranges early position. Now, how is that possible? Because, we generally want to continue around the minimum defense frequency. Sure, with ICM, we deviate a little bit, and there's always some room, and, turns is not 100% minimum defense frequency because there's also, future game involved, etc. But it's always usually around the minimum defense frequency. So how is that then when I'm saying, we want to do more bluff catching versus late position than versus early position? And we will look at that in a minute, because this is kind of crucial, because the same kind of mechanism then applies to also the difference between chip EV and ICM. But yeah, we will be doing more bluff catching versus late position ranges. All right. So I start you guys off with a question, and then we jump into the solutions. On which of these boards do we defend the least amount of no draw bluff catchers? So 7x and 3x on this board. So this is an ICM situation, by the way. 25% of the field left, roughly 60 big blinds average stacks. We are having a moderate risk disadvantage in the big blind. The button has 74 bigs, but it doesn't matter here because chippy V, it would be the same. So, but you can familiarize yourself with that situation. We're going to look at this with different boards also more often today. So on which of these boards do we defend the least amount of no-draw bluff catchers? And so you see it's the same board, of course, same sizings, but the 10 is always a different suit. A is the correct answer. And the reason is simply the 10 is the same suit as top pair, meaning here that 7x and 3x can both have flush draws, and they are, of course, then third pair and second pair with a draw, so that doesn't count. But, our strategy will be, for our bluff catchers now, will be weighted heavily around that. Now, we will still defend a few offsuit 7x, but not nearly as many as board B, where there's no flush draw, no draw available at all for our second and third pair. So the strategy will be different, actually. There will, now the blockers are more impactful for what we want to continue with, and we will see that. And then C, there's some draws available for second pair, but not for third pair, because the 10 has the same suit as third pair, so it cannot have a pair plus a flush draw. So because of that, we will defend the least amount of no draw bluff catchers in example A. So let's look at that. With that, we will start going into some of these solutions here. So this is not A, and so I click on third pair and low pair, and I click on no draw here, and you see we really don't defend with many no draw bluff catchers. It's king 7, queen 7, not ace, X, and these are all blocker effects, because the kicker, having a high kicker in itself doesn't matter here, because it's not like opponent is value betting whatever 6-7 or something. No, it is just blocker effects here. So we have a little bit of that, but we're folding 92.2% of our no draw bluff catchers here. And then obviously anything worse as well. Then we go to example B, where there's no draw available. So let's look at how we defend now our no draw bluff catchers. So now we have the ace added. Again, this has to do with how he is betting. These are blocker effects. He has a different betting range now. Interestingly enough here, we're defending some 6-3, which is no draw, 5-3 and 4-3. And so with that, it's already clear that in ICM, it doesn't matter. In ICM, we're facing very often very polarized ranges, let's say. Like if our opponent has like huge risk advantage, he can bet a bit more depolarized, or like a little bit thinner basically for value. But often we face much more polarized ranges than in chippy V, and therefore, all our bluff catchers, they're just bluff catchers, and it matters a lot because it's so nut heavy basically, our opponent's value range, or nut heavier, let's say, that it just matters a lot to be blocking certain hands. Or unblocking bluffs. This, again, blocker effects basically. So here we're folding only 80% of our no draw bluff catchers. And then lastly, it's just in between, again, there's one flush draw available, and we are folding 87% of them. So a little bit more again. So just to prime you for that concept that when draws are available, our strategy for bluff catching heavily will be weighted towards them. They will be the first to continue 100% of the time. And if there are sufficiently enough bluff catchers that can have even just a gut shot to go with them, that will be enough then. And we will just ditch all of our other, a second pair, third pair, or well, it depends on the bet sizing. So here we're only facing a 67% bet sizing. Our second pair will still continue a lot here. But whenever we're facing overbets or whatever, again, depends always on the bet sizing. The more draws available, the more our strategy will evolve around that basically. Okay. Now, before we get into the actual topic now, I want to briefly look at what I said, early position versus late position versus the big blind and the bluff catching involved. Because again, this concept here is also something we can get out of for understanding what we need to do when we are bluff catching in ICM. So this here is under the gun opening, big blind defending. We have the Jack 6 deuce flop, 60 big blinds effective, c-bet 33%, a call, a 10 on the turn, no draws, and he bets 83% here. And again, we focus on just our third pair and low pair, just the bluff catchers here, and the hands that start mixing, not our pure calls. Second pair plus is just pure calls. And we see we're folding here versus early position 62.6%. Now, look at the same spot versus the button, same sizings, everything. And then we look at a third pair and low pair, and we see that we are folding only 41%. However, when I take all this away and we look at our overall fold frequency, 45% here versus EP, and actually 47% versus late position. So it's roughly the same, basically. We even overall fold a little bit more in this instance versus the late position. So how is it possible then that we do less bluff catching? Well, it is the range composition. It started pre-flop already. When we look at flop, our ranges is already tighter. So you see here versus EP, we have much tighter range already to start with. So we have less, nothing hands, which you see represented here also. So no made hands here, 32%. Here it's 37%. And then we will also fold a little bit more, not percentage-wise necessarily out of that no made hands, but we will just fold some additional types of hands. And all that just leads to us simply arriving to the turn with a tighter range. And this mechanism will apply to how we adjust an ICM too. Not the exact same way, but, just the mechanic that we just arrive to the turn with a different range, and how we do that we will look at later on. So for example, when we take here all of our pure continues versus early position, we see our pure continues are 29.1% of our range, second pair plus basically. And we do the same here and look at second pair plus, they are only 25.2% of our range. So we just need to add more bluff catchers. Also, of course, the range composition of our opponent is weaker, so we can afford to, add more. It all is interchanging basically. And then, we can just also more comfortably add more bluff catchers in there. But yeah, we just have simply less strong hands here in our range. And we need to mix in more bluff catchers there because we're also up against weaker ranges. So anyways, keep that in mind as we now get into our actual topic. All right, so I will always do it compared to chip EV. So here we have the chip EV situation. And I have here board, 60 big blinds effective, A7-5, c-bet, and then the 10 on the turn, and then he bets pot. And by the way, sometimes I have adjusted basically the sizing so that they are the same. So I picked, for example, when ICM wanted to prefer a certain sizing, I just adjusted the chip EV sizing to that so that we have direct comparison of the impact. So doesn't always mean that chip EV takes that strategy of bet sizing, but I wanted to have the direct comparison. Yeah, now I want to show you this effect and what's happening here. So this is chip EV. In this case, there are no draws yet. So we have not a dry board, but we have a board where there are no draws available for our second and third pairs. You see here, of course, also in chip EV, there are blocker effects. Like, clearly I assume that we are just unblocking a lot with these 7-4, 7-3, 7 deuce. We're unblocking a lot of bluffs, I must assume. But then again, we also probably block a lot of value with the king 7, queen 7, etc. So there are blocker effects, definitely. But yeah, it's a bit more spread across the board here. Now, and we're folding overall 71.4% of the time. So now we have the ICM scenario, 25% of the field left. Button has 71 big blinds now after raising, and we have 55 big blinds and same sizings. And what's happening now to how we are continuing with our third and low pair? We are folding 81% of the time. So first of all, first thing to notice in this instance is that we are overfolding by 10% here of our bluff catchers. However, overall, we still also call around the same, a little bit, we fold a little bit more, but again, we're still like staying around the minimum defense frequency. So how can we afford to now fold 81% of our bluff catchers? So we will get into that in a minute. But first of all, I also want to show here that now the focus is shifting also from You saw before it was here, like these 7-3, 7 deuce, 5 deuce, etc. And then the top regions. We still have some of that here, but it's actually clearly now shifting towards like the second and third pair, and then a card that is close to the second and third pair. Again, these are blocker effects, given the range composition of our opponent. I have to say I've noticed a lot, but could be coincidence. That is just the boards that I looked at. But very often, even when the draw didn't get there, we kind of continue with, on these kinds of boards where we have no draws available to go with them, we still continue with second pair with the kicker next to it very often or close to it. But I haven't exactly figured out why. I don't know, because he maybe wants us to have, like, in this case here, 9-6, for example, which we're folding now to a pot size bet. So therefore he's not bluffing any 9x and 6x or whatever, or 9x and 8x, something like that, to do with wanting to have us gut shots. It's possible, but you know, again, I don't want to get too much into the blockers. It's just clear that there are blocker effects here and that they're pretty heavy, basically. How is it possible? What do we need to do in order to be able to still fold roughly around the same time? And this is, you know, a moderate example. There are sometimes examples which we see later on where we fold even more of our bluff catchers or no draw bluff catchers compared to the chip EV. So how can we do that, right? Because we still need to be able to continue the appropriate amount. It basically starts pre-flop already. Same with like the comparison from late position to early position. First of all, with ICM, of course, when we have the risk disadvantage, we already are calling tighter in the big blind. That's the first big thing. We have less, you know, rack, nothing burger hands basically on the flop. That's one thing. The other thing is, and this is very often going to be the case, look at the top of our range here in the ICM scenario. We're raising 17.4% of the time. Then we look at the top of our range in the chip EV scenario, 35.3% of the time. So we're raising much less of the top of our range very often anyways. There's sometimes the ICM strategy is like we're using a smaller sizing than in chip EV, and it's like a drawy board where our small pairs maybe need a lot of, you know, they're very break-evenish already to play, and then we maybe raise them quite a lot or whatever. We see that later in one instance. But very often we actually raise, and you know, when we want to raise these small pairs, we need to raise more value also. Like when we want to raise more weekends, we need to raise more value. But anyways, most of the time we actually slow play way more, especially two pair and top pair. So, and in this instance here, it's actually two pair that slow plays the most. Like if you look at it here, like it's just basically pure raising in the chip EV scenario, and here like we're actually calling more than we're raising. And also the top pair is slightly, I mean, still significant, like 11.8% chip EV, 4.6% here only. Sometimes it's even a much more drastic scenario. And then, so what happens here? We have already, starting pre-flop, we have less bottom of range hands, right? Then we're also still folding a little bit more of the bottom of range hands, not necessarily percentage wise, but we're just folding more types of bottom of range hands now in an ICM scenario with risk disadvantage. It depends. We will see that later. But anyways, we do that. And then we continue with more of the top of our range. So basically, we just have a much more top heavy range percentage-wise, and much less bottom hands, like bottom of range hands. So we can afford to cut some out in the middle, fold some more bluff catchers, because overall that will still end up for us being the same percentage. Okay, now before we move on, I want to show you something pre-flop also. So let's take this spot. So the button opens 74 big blinds, and then the big blind. So yes, we're folding more bottom of range hands compared to chip EV here. Like we're folding a bunch more hands basically. That's not only all that is very necessary to do in order to not end up with too many marginal hands on the flop already, and then maybe consequently on the turn. This stuff here is super important. Like if you hadn't thought about that, you need to do that. Like you need to raise these hands appropriately often enough. If you don't do that, just add up all the combos that you get to the flop with. These are also combos now that we don't have anymore, like these marginal combos that we just 3-bet pre-flop, that we now don't have to navigate on the flop. Even if we call correctly, like we fold the correct amounts of hands, but then we end up just calling all of the rest of this, or like calling it too much. This is quite impactful and hurtful to our bluff catching strategy later on in game. So always think about that as well. All right. So now we focus on a board. This is still the same scenario. Again, chippy V versus this is chippy V, and then we compare it to the same scenario, 25% of field left. But now we have a board where our second and third pairs have draws available. So let's see what's going on here. Here we also look at the under pairs, second pair, third pair, and low pair here this time. So all the pairs basically. And this is chippy V, and we do the same here now in ICM. At first glance, it's like, well, okay, we only fold 47% more, not much of a difference, but it is actually a huge difference, because when we let's focus first on third pair and low pair, third pair, low pair, and I take out all the no draw hands, zero continues. So here, third pair and low pair, no matter if it's chippy V or ICM, we already only continue with draws anyways. Okay, so this is not so interesting then, because it's the same, other than that the range is composed differently. We're gonna get to that. But then let's look at under pair and second pair. When we have here no draws, in the chippy V scenario, we're still continuing with a bunch of them, like king 5, queen 5, jack 5, and then 8s and 7s, and so we're folding only 55% of our no draw hands, whereas in the ICM scenario, we're folding 92%. So basically everything other than 9s and 8s. And this is a bit deceiving. Not to think that these higher pairs are better usually than having a pair, like a bottom pair or whatever. Usually it's actually not the case. The only reason why we even continue at all with 9s and 8s here is that in this instance, even in the ICM scenario, our opponent is actually betting a little bit merged. He's betting, he's betting some 4s here. He's betting some 5-4 suited, some 6-5, 6s. So with 9s, of course, we beat all that stuff. That is the only reason why we continue here with low pairs. In fact, usually they are worse when we have like the pairs in ICM scenarios. They are the worst bluff catchers when they are under pairs or third pairs or whatever. They are the worst bluff catchers, because we not only do we also, just like any other pair, have just a pure bluff catcher. We don't block anything or unblock anything. Well, maybe sometimes, but rarely. So they're usually actually worse even than having like a 5x or whatever. Here it's only better because we're beating some of our opponent's value range. Range pre is not the same. Like chippy V and ICM ranges are different, of course. So no, it is not the same range. But that's the whole point, right? Because the ranges are composed differently, we're following different strategies. So here, what happens here? How do we then do it so that we can afford to fold more hands? Like, so for example, when we still look at the third pair and low pair, this is the chippy V scenario. Third pair, low pair, that's like what, 19%. We end up on turn with more third pair and low pair that we can actually continue with. Because if we look at it like without draws, we're actually we're folding less third pair and low pair in the ICM scenario, on the other hand. But how is that possible, right? Well, because we are just simply playing it differently on the flop. So now here kind of applies this mechanism that I just mentioned. Let's compare both. Okay, so look at the difference here, how we're playing the flop, our low pairs differently. We're actually here raising a lot of these deuce X hands, and we're raising a lot of them that have no backdoor draws. So we continue, with 9 deuce of diamonds. Also 5x probably more continues with the, here we're raising them more actually. In any case, we're just raising more of the marginal, deuce X hands here that would not make any backdoor, don't have any draws on turn, that are forced to fold on the turn. It's like a similar concept in my mind as to raising pre-flop against the button open, raising sometimes the king 6 offsuit, right? We want to get rid of some marginal hands in this instance here to be able to then continue more appropriately often with our bottom pair, right? Yeah, so that's how we were able to navigate this here. So it is all about arriving to the turn with different ranges than in chip EV, and, making sure that we can fold appropriately often enough compared to the chip EV scenario, our bluff catchers. Now, same flop, but different turn card. This is just ICM now. So just want to show you something here, because now, second pair is still flopped top pair. So we just look at third pair and low pair. What happens here is actually now we're folding 79% of our third pair and low pair. And how are we able to do that now on a king of clubs turn? Well, what happened here is simply where we defended a bunch of king X on the flop. You see, we have now a lot of king X that we can continue with that is clearly preferred. So there's a lot of hands that we have additionally now that we can continue on the turn, where we don't need to continue as much with our third pair and low pair. And then also now there's two flush draws out there. So for example, an ace high flush draw, let's just take whatever, ace 7 of diamonds here, as the EV is, the dollar EV is $23.36 in EV. Now let's take flopped top pair. So meaning here it's second pair, but it was the flopped top pair. Let's just take, ace 10. It's $11 in EV only. We make more money by continuing with ace 7 of clubs or ace 7 of diamonds than we're making with ace 10. It shows you how much more important it is. Because we're facing such polarized ranges, it is much more important. Bluff catcher. It's much more important improvability and blockers also. Sometimes block, but more so improvability actually is more important. And when we don't have improvability, it's a lot of blockers. But it is, you see, again, like we're facing super polarized ranges. So, it's even better to continue this than we're still beating bluffs with, ace 7 of diamonds, as we do with ace 10. But we have even improvability to beat more of their hands on the river. What I want to do here is I want to focus on second pair. So what do we have here? It's exact same scenario actually. Well, average stack is 35 big blinds here. No, it's not the exact. Sorry, it's a different scenario. We have like a slight risk advantage from the button, and we have roughly 40 big blinds effective, 35 big blind average stack, 25% of the field left. Ace queen 6 flop, he c-bets 25%, and then on the turn he bets 107%. And I want to look at two different turns, and I want to look at second pair in particular. This is for once this one with the deuce on the turn, and then we have the 10 on the turn. No, not this one, this one. Okay, look at the difference here for our second pair. So first of all, here we're continuing 38.6, we're folding 38.6% only of our second pair. Here, we're folding 72% of our second pair, and there's a clear preference to what we continue with. It's king queen and queen jack, because that has, not only blockers to the nuts, and it has improvability. And we're folding everything else. Now here, not that GTO has any feelings, but if it had feelings, it would just be reluctantly adding these hands, because there's just nothing else or very little else it can add. Here, we have draws to go with. So now it rather adds here third pair with, jack 10. It prefers that over any queen X hand here. And look at the EV of jack 10 here. Like again, it's blocking the nuts and it has improvability. The EV here is $4. So it's ace queen 10, right? We have third pair on like a bad board, and it's $4 EV. Now let's look at a queen 8 on the ace queen 6 deuce board, where it's second pair, and it's only $1 in EV. And you take any of the others and they're not better, they're worse than the jack 10 on the other board. It shows you the huge impact of, again, like these are bluff catchers anyways. We're facing polarized ranges. We're not blocking anything. This is just being, again, not really, but if it had feelings, being reluctantly added to it, because there's just nothing else we can defend. We need to defend some queen X hands here. Now look at this. While here, queen jack is clearly preferred here in king queen. In this other scenario, we actually do not want to have queen jack. And why is that here? Because now the blockers are important in the other way around. Continuing with queen X, we want him to have bluffs, like Jack 10 are lots of his bluffs, King Jack, specifically Jack 10 is bluffing a lot here. So having a Jack is bad for us here. King Queen, we're blocking a lot more of his value. So King Queen, we're blocking Ace King, we're blocking even also two pairs Ace Queen. So we're blocking more of the value. When we look at his bluffing range, as I said, he's bluffing more Jack 10 than Jack. You see all the Jack 10 offsuit combos here, and more so than King Jack. But even King Jack has the Jack in it also, of course. So yeah, that's why we continue that. So huge difference. Okay, now so far we have seen only us overfolding the bluff catchers. My question to you guys is: so ICM scenario, 160 left, 150 paid. In terms of frequency, do we fold more or less of our bluff catchers on the turn and river as the covered stack compared to chip EV? Well, we've seen already, we're folding, so far we've been folding more. The question for the people who didn't pay attention is, do we fold the same or less? Or is it maybe depends? What do you guys think? The answer actually is depends, and we will see an example of that. And I don't want to say too much of that yet because I have right away another question for you guys. So now I want to compare, and we will get into the answer of that in a minute. Now we have here a scenario where this is near bubble. So almost exact bubble, 152 left, 150 paid. Average stack is 50 big blinds, and we have 66 big blinds. And by the way, we will see now the other example will be we have 55 big blinds, and one could say like maybe the stack size makes a difference. I have run the same thing and I manually added the stacks the same, and it doesn't matter. So this is irrelevant of stacks. They are close enough that the effect is the same basically. So we have roughly 60 big blinds here in the big blind basically, and the button has a huge risk advantage. And now let's look at how we continue with our bluff catchers in this case. Here there's no draws available, exactly. So there's no draws available for our bluff catchers on turn. So we're folding 56.1% of them. Yeah, so, we're calling more third pair, and then low pair we are, folding even more so. So 56. My question now is, if I change this scenario to giving the button only a moderate risk advantage. So now we go back to that situation where we have 55.7 big blinds or whatever, and our opponent has 74 big blinds on the button. And we have the exact same board, same sizing, same run out. Do we then fold more bluff catchers or less? So will we fold more of our bluff catchers versus stack with moderate risk advantage or less? So here we're folding 56%. Now versus moderate, the same scenario, but the button has a little bit less chips. He has 74 big blinds. Do we fold more or less of our bluff catchers? Is the question. Third pair, low pair, 65%. So what's happening here? And this now goes into the question before this one, because paradoxically enough, when our opponent has huge risk advantage, sometimes he's just, first of all, he's opening a ton on the button now, and he's just c-betting everything, and he gets to the turn. First of all, we can already also continue because of that a little bit wider on the flop versus him. Also pre-flop actually. Now on turn, the same applies. It's like his range is just simply so much wider. While we can't go overboard, but we can call a little bit more of our, we construct the range already such that, we construct the range already on the flop such that, we will be having to call a little bit more with our third and low pairs. And this is just simply because his range is just weaker, basically. And yeah, it's not like a huge difference, but there is a difference. Like if you look specifically here, there's certain hands that we just pure continue that we don't continue at all, like the 10-4, what else, 5-4 suited more. Yeah, there's a bunch of hands basically. Also, 7-3 suited, etc. And you see also we have more of those basically. So, all I want to say with that is it's not written in stone. Yeah, it's to not misconceptualize, whenever you're up against a huge stack with a huge risk advantage that you think you need to just way overfold can actually be to the contrary. Not that you know, of course you still need to be careful and tight. Like you can still afford to widen your range slightly there against someone who's like opening super wide, right? So now we get to the rivers a little bit. So here we have scenario chip EV with big bets involved. You know, Queen 7 deuce, he just bets 39% on the flop. Bets slight overbet on the turn, 60 big blinds effective, and then he bets, another overbet on the river, 120%. And yet still we're calling most of our top pairs in the chip EV scenario. Now, in ICM, this looks very different very often. First of all, we get to the river with way more pair. Again, structuring our range already such that, we get to the river with a lot of top hands, basically. Like here, it's 40% of our range is top pair. In the chip EV scenario, it's only 28% of our range. But we also need to forward 50% of that. So we basically need to mix here. And you see even here again, kicker doesn't matter here. It's the blocker effect. Like king, queen is here actually bad for whatever reason. Obviously, I mean, most likely he's just bluffing a lot of king X hands. I think in fact, this is what it is here. I looked at that. When we look at king high, he's jamming, or maybe not. Let's see. Or it's more value. Could also be, or less value. Let's see though. Yeah, well, it is still can be a bigger part. So king high 15%. No, that's not it. In any case, it's still a blocker effect. Probably then it must be the value. So in any case, we're just basically mixing with our top pairs on the river. In this case, of course, it's not always going to be that exact amount. It depends always on stack size, on bet sizing and everything. But just to show it as one example, where mixing like here, for example, of course, if we were to know that in game that roughly, okay, I gotta call you roughly 50% of the time. So now here, and this is what I want to get into also, mixing would be very helpful, and we can't just do that in our head. And that the more you study, the more you will understand these spots where you need to mix an appropriate amount of hands. And I used to actually be against using an RNG in game. I just felt like in tournaments, I just always felt like, there's so much the playing field. I understand the field a lot, and there's so many spots where I know I can just rather pick one route over the other. Like when I know it's a mix, but I feel like in this spot, the field does this or they react like this. And so I can always take this option instead. I don't have that opinion anymore, because the more you study, also when this is now calling, where you see here's one important spot. But then if you look at also being able to bluff appropriately, like when we open from the button and the big blind calls, and then on turns, a lot of the time we need to mix a lot of our air hands and so on. By now I play with an RNG, and I personally would recommend doing that, getting into the habit of that. Studying also with the trainer in G2 Wizard to, get a better and better intuition for the frequencies. Now, of course, the trainer will not be ICM. I also always encourage when you feel like, that's a close spot probably, or like always every once in a while check an appropriate ICM spot, like check it with 50% of field left, check it with 25% of field left, final table, and so on. But just training and practicing to increase the intuition of that, because of course none of us can play this perfectly, none of us can mix correctly, but I still think, a lot of the spots we will know that, okay, this is a mix between raise and call. And then even in spots like this where we're calling down, we will know that we can call always. And instead of having a bias in our head, like certain people, we all have our biases. Some people are too tight, like also with Bluffcatchers, whether it be on turn and on river. Some people are too tight, and then when you don't use an RNG, especially when you're in a bad mindset and you're paranoid because you've been losing a lot, you end up just overfolding too much. Then on the other hand, some people have the tendency of being too sticky. And then also, again, most often, especially then when you're in a bad mindset, you end up calling too much. You just end up being paranoid all the time. Oh, I got to call here. I got to call here. Well, one resolution against that in this case, what we've seen hopefully here is like a lot of the time there's actually certain bluff catchers preferred on turns specifically anyways, especially on drawy boards. It's always going to be the boards, the second and third pairs, etc., that have something to go with them. And if it's not that, if it's a board where there's no draws, then it's usually blocker effects. But here too, like as humans, do we always know the blocker effects? No. So I would say practically it's probably even good as a human. On a lot of boards, we will not exactly on the fly figure out now which blocker is best. So it is good there too to mix actually with an RNG in game. So yeah, I really recommend doing that. Okay, so lastly, before this is an interesting scenario too. So here we have, roughly 5 big blinds effective. This is chip EV. I want to show something here also on the river. So we have here a bet and then a pot bet on turn and then an all-in on the river for 84%. Now this is chip EV and this is ICM and this is second pair. Look at now, second pair here, on the other hand, in the ICM scenario is folding less, is calling more, 21%. Look at Jack 10 here in the chip EV, it's just folding, whereas here, it's calling more. What's happening? Well, therefore, it is folding more top pairs. And why is that? Well, just here too. In this case, it's the river. The blocker is more important than the kicker, or in this case, even the type of pair we have. Like we're facing such polarized ranges that we rather had the Jack 10 and block the nuts here. Like again, compared to chip EV, we're facing much thinner value bets, much less thinner value bets. So that means we're facing way more polarized ranges. So the top of their range is always going to be more nut heavy. So we want to rather block the nuts than, have just pure top pair. So that's the difference here. Yeah. So we're folding over on more because we're folding more top pairs in this case. And again, we go for blockers here for the call downs rather than anything else. Even third pair. I mean, it's third pair I haven't looked at. I just saw that now. So let's check this out also. What's going on with third pair? But third pair, they're all both calling, looks like 59%, but still here too, like way more preferred. So we take a bunch of the top pairs out and then move that towards second and third pair with blockers because they are just better second and third pairs that have better blockers basically. There's a big difference here, how we approach the river spots with our bluff catching. So don't think so much in terms of, okay, I have top pair. I probably got to always call you. No, it's like, okay, how many second pair? Like, first of all, it depends on the spot, right? It's not every spot is the same, but in this case here, okay, how many second pair and third pairs do I have? Maybe what's his betting range? Like, is he value betting, value jamming, a queen 9 here, or is he not, And if he's not, then it doesn't matter for me to have, queen 9 or queen 7 or whatever, or queen jack, So that's what you want to think about there. All right. So ICM. Well, first of all, it is not as simple as saying, well, the more ICM pressure, the more we fold bluff catchers on turn. As one example that we have seen, like if opponent on button has huge risk advantage pre, he might open so wide pre and c-bet so much that we are a big favorite on many turns. And the board structure and runout is a determining factor as well. Like sometimes, some board runouts are better for us than others, etc. But yeah, most of the time it is true, like especially when we are up against like stacks that have moderate risk advantage against us, we will be folding more. And I should have mentioned that our focus will be mostly on the covered stack. And I just want to talk a little bit about being the covering stack in the big blind. We will do that in a minute, but I don't feel like I need to show you many examples. So yeah, we will talk about that though. To solve the problem of bluff catching with ICM, as the covered stack, well, we need to think holistically. The solution to the bluff catching problem does not start on the turn. It starts rather pre-flop by folding already an appropriate amount. This is one reason why we want to fold so much there, or so much more there, let's say, compared to chip EV. It really starts there. And not only that, not only do we need to make now more folds, we still need to keep in mind that we also need to 3-bet an appropriate amount of our marginal, ace rag, king rag hands on a bunch of stacks, right? Then post-flop, well, start folding more bottom of range hands on the flop right away so that we, similar to the early position versus late position comparison, so that we arrive already to the turn with less bottom of our range type hands. And then also very important, slow playing more strong hands on flop and turn, slow playing more two-pair hands very often, more top-pair hands very often. Again, there might be some boards that have some that are exceptions, but very often we will do this. All right. So now as the covering stack, the overall approach technically is really the same. Like, for example, we also here will be slow playing compared to chip EV. We will still be on many boards slow playing more often top pair and two pair, etc. It will be less most often though than if we are the covered stack. So there's varying degrees here. And also, of course, we call much wider pre-flop. So we sometimes might actually overfold a little bit, even compared to being the covered stack, because we call so wide. Again, this depends on the board structure and how good or bad it is for us. Sometimes if it's very good for us, of course, one solution is also to just donk a ton as the covering stack. I think that's also one solution to, make up for that and leverage that our opponent cannot raise as much, etc., and doesn't want to build these big pots. We do a little bit less slow playing, but we overfold on the flop sometimes. Now, overall, though, it will still be the same. It's just to a lesser degree in certain areas, basically. So, that's why I didn't want to really, and I think, it's always tougher. Anyways, we face more aggression when we are the covered stack. When we are the covering stack, in my experience, people really kind of play timid against us, and they play very straightforward, actually. So it's the tougher spot when we are the covered stack. And then I try to put this whole thing where we just looked at, to put this in one sentence. I feel like it's conceptualized minimum defense frequency in context of range composition. Now, what do I mean? Well, minimum defense frequency, conceptualized minimum defense frequency in context of range composition means that we can't really figure that out in game, like as a solver does, obviously. We always will be abstracting and we will never be getting it correctly. But we still want to kind of think about that, right? We want to think about, first of all, we want to think about these things. Like, okay, I had to fold more preflop, have to three bet a bunch of my marginal hands on top of that. I need to slow play more of my top hands. So I'm sure, okay, I'm on the turn. I have more two pair hands here. Need to be aware of that. I have more top pair hands here than in chip EV. Okay, so which bluff catchers? And then also, is it a dry board? Is it a drawy board? If it's a drawy board, always look at all the bluff catchers you can continue with that have something to go with them. They will continue 100% of the time. Well, depending on the sizing. I mean, but most often they will. And then understand, okay, is that enough? What's the sizing? If it's a big sizing, very often that will be enough then. And if it's a smaller sizing, well, think about, okay, is he supposed to bet this small of a sizing here? This seems rather drawy. So I have all these draws, but probably I got to mix in maybe a few more of my bluff catchers. In any ways, it's a conceptualized thing. You can't really do the math on that in game, but you have to have all these factors at least in mind. Okay. So back to using an RNG. Yeah, I do recommend using one. I personally, there's, you can find them on even Google App Store or whatever, or Play Store or whatever that is. That's where I have mine from. It's a detachable thing. You can take it off from the browser and then you just put it somewhere. I really like to use that now. I think the more you study, the more you really want to use it also to implement what you've learned in terms of frequencies and so on. But before you do all that, there's still questions you want to ask yourself. So, first of all, are there certain bluff catchers preferred over others on this board? Again, if it's a drawy board or like if there's so many draws available, probably don't need to mix that much and rather pick the exact combos that you need to use. Do I have bluff catchers that have draws to go with? Well, that is that. What is my opponent's bluffing range and what is his value range? This is important on, like, if it's a board where we don't have draws to go with, it's like, you can try to figure that out basically, right? Like what are a lot of his bluffs? Like, do I know what he's preferring to bluff with? And then maybe I don't want to have that kicker or whatever. And then I rather want to unblock his bluffs or whatever, or, things like that. This is more complicated. Again, I feel like on those types of boards where there are no draws available, mixing is a good practical solution for a human, honestly. But yeah, one can ask oneself that still. And yeah, how many strong hands do I have? What RNG app am I using? I gotta, let me check that for a second. I think it's called Poker Randomizer. Let me see. Yeah, Poker GTO Randomizer. Then you can here detach that here, and then you can just put it anywhere on your screen. And then you do this, and then it just automatically always rolls every few seconds. And the way I do it is, I have a couple of tables and I have a decision, and whenever I look on this thing, this is the number that I roll basically. Yeah. So, I recommend using something like this. And this is free, by the way. This is just for free. Okay. How many pure folds do I have? How many ace high or worse continues? Just understanding, for example, that like we've seen on the flop with the king of clubs, right? Like now there were 2 flush draws out there on the turn. So now naturally you need to understand, okay, well, I have now a bunch of ace high that can continue. I don't need, and you see that these are actually clearly preferred over, at least over the pairs with no draws. So you must understand that now you don't need to continue with as many pair bluff catchers basically. So this is also very important to always understand. How much ace high can I continue with, right? How many pure fold hands? What is my minimum defense frequency? It doesn't always have to, you don't obviously in every decision want to calculate that. Although, one could, and yeah, maybe I should do that also. There, you can just create a chart for that. It's not that tough really. And then, you could even have a chart. And whenever you face a bet sizing, you can just look at that chart and then okay, well, he bets this and this is how much of my range I need to continue with. It would be actually helpful. I guess I'm just lazy with that. But yeah, knowing that, of course, always will help your minimum defense frequency. Okay, so just to recap a little bit of what we talked about here. Realistic approach to solve the problem to bluff catching. So not only isolate the problem on the turn, it really starts earlier, pre-flop already. Using an RNG, in my opinion, at least for dry boards or boards where the second pairs, third pairs don't have anything to go with. With high ICM pressure, top pairs become bluff catchers often, and depends on the stack size, of course, on rivers and will be folded a lot with big bets and deeper stacks. So, well, we've seen even the 35 big blind stacks or our top pairs were folding a lot, and then we were mixing rather in second pairs with kickers. So yeah, again, like this I leave up to you, of course, to study the exact board structures, but there will be many rivers to where we need to fold a lot of pairs. And then, again, this also ties into mixing. Using the RNG then will be very helpful. On boards with draws, our bluff catchers on turn are heavily weighted towards pairs with draws to go with. At least a gut shot, yeah. On dry boards, we need to find appropriate mixing strategy or find the blockers, but as human, I think that's quite tough in game. And due to facing more polarized ranges on river, blocking nuts with our bluff catcher on top pairs is much more important than having high kickers. In general, even on turns, we're facing more polarized ranges most often. So blockers, if no draws are available, blockers are really an important factor actually, kind of. At least if you want to play GTO. Now, the thing is we cannot play GTO anyways. And again, as humans, maybe, we just want to find the appropriate mixes. The bigger the sizing we face, the less bluff catching, as already mentioned. And then also you can always ask yourself, how much of my pure value do I have? Like how many hands do I have anyways that I 100% continues, right? So the more pure value we have, the less bluff catching we need to do. That was it from me. And I hope, that I could enlighten you a bit on that topic. It is certainly a very tough topic and remains one. I can only point out the things to look out for, the studying work you need to do for yourself and look at different boards and so on. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and otherwise wish you nice holidays and Merry Christmas, and hopefully see you in the next webinar.